Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the special edition of Horror Reads. And this one's special because normally I just do book reviews. I read a book, and then I get on here on my little cheap microphone in my little cheap apartment here in Cambodia, and I tell you what I thought about it. All the books on my channel are those I recommend. I don't do negative reviews, so if I don't like it, I just don't talk about it. But this one might seem obligatory, all right, because I know there's a lot of channels out there that review books, and it seems if you're talking about horror, you have to talk about Stephen King. He's called the master of horror for a reason. He's probably the most prolific horror fiction author out there, maybe the most prolific author of all times, perhaps. And I'm sure if you're into the horror fiction thing, you've read him or you've heard about him. There's really no way to escape it. But I want you to know I'm not doing this out of obligation. Okay, I got a horror book channel. I have to do Stephen King. It's nothing like that. I'm doing this because I want to, and mainly because out of the my top three Stephen King books, and that will probably be hotly debated among Stephen King fans anytime that kind of thing is brought up, my top whatever Stephen King books. I got one in there that I think does not get enough appreciation when it comes to those lists. The other two are probably on a lot of lists. But hey, everybody's opinion is different. So let me know down below, what are your three top Stephen King books? And why? And I'm going to do the same for you right now. And I'm going to tell you why. So let's do this right now. All right, so we are going to start out. I'm going to start at number 3 and work my way up to my number 1. And these are books, I've read most of Stephen King's books, but I've read a lot of them only once. So I'm limiting this to Stephen King books that I've read multiple times. Probably the most times. And it's not because they're not as scary, or these are more scary, more horrific, or necessarily better than any of his other books. But something about all three of these got to me. They got their hooks in my brain, and I couldn't let them go for different reasons. So this list isn't to say these are the best Stephen King books. I'm saying these are my top 3 favorites based on the fact that I've read them all so many times that they're just ingrained in my brain. All right? So I wanted to make that clear. And we're going to start with number 3. And that book is Pet Sematary. I know all of these books have been made into movies. I'm not going to talk about the movies. I've seen the movies. I don't want to talk about them, except maybe in my number 1 pick, but we'll get to that. Pet Sematary, the first time I read that book, I was absolutely blown away. I loved everything about it. I loved the family. I loved the old neighbors next door. I loved the setting. Everything about it clicked for me in some way. And the thoughts of a cursed burial ground where you could bury your dead pets, and as we find out, humans, and they would rise back from the graves, not quite as zombies, but not quite right in the head. I don't know why, but when I first read it, that really frightened me. To me, that was like one of the scariest things I've ever read at the time. Because if you know Stephen King, you know, or at least for me, when I'm reading his books, I'm in that world. Like, what I'm seeing happening in my mind is more realistic when I'm reading than what's actually happening around me in real life. So I could buy into the fact that this kind of thing existed. And at the heart of it, I think it's about loss and how would you react? You know, the emotions you go through, the trauma you go through when you're dealing with grief, and how far would you go to get back a loved one that had died in that kind of situation? You know, how far would you go even if you knew the results could be very, very bad? And, you know, if you've ever grieved for anybody, you know that grief can do strange things to people, make them make bad decisions all the time. And this book pushes that boundary into, you know, the supernatural realm. But I really love that book. I've read it, I can't even begin to tell you how many times. It's probably not a once a year read, but at least once every 2 years since it's came out, I reread that book. I always find new things that I like about it, and that's why it's my number 3 favorite Stephen King book. Now, number 2 is going to be one this is the one I don't think gets enough love when it comes to these lists. Everybody has a list, my top 3, my top 5, my top 10 Stephen King books. And this one is hardly ever mentioned when it comes to that. But my number 2 favorite Stephen King book, and the one I've read more times than most of them, is Geralds Game. Now, I know it's not the typical, I guess you could say, Stephen King book. But if you like psychological horror, turned up to 11, I don't think there's a better book example out there than Gerald's Game. Just the situation this woman finds herself in, and how, and if you tried to explain the book to somebody who's never read it and doesn't know anything about it, it would be weird, because it sounds like something that would work better as a short story, not a whole novel, right? Because some authors might try to force a novel out of it, but it would be a little bit too long and a little bit too clunky, but not with Stephen King. And I just like the isolation of the character, and how we learn about her past from her mind while she's laying there suffering. I love the tension about it. I mean, she can't move, she can't do anything, she can't go anywhere, and you got hungry stray dogs that are sniffing around. You got that really creepy maniac near the end of the book, and she doesn't know if he's in her mind or not. But at any time, because she's so helpless, she could just die tragically and horribly. And so the first time I read it, I remember the tension just building and building and building, and I was never sure she was actually ever going to get out of that situation or not, because you never know with Stephen King, you know? This could have been a character he killed off. But I enjoyed it so much, I remember as soon as I read it, I think it was the week after I read the book for the first time, I started reading it again, because I knew there were things I missed. When I first heard about the book and heard about the premise, my first thought was, as I said before, sounds like a good short story, but a novel? And it's set in one location, mainly about one woman. I didn't think it was my cup of tea. I didn't think I'd be into it as much. So the first time I read it, even though I wound up enjoying it immensely, I knew I had probably mentally skipped things in the book, little things that I hate to miss in a Stephen King book. So I about a week later, I went back, started reading it all over with my full 100% attention. And ever since then, I've read it, again, more times than I can remember, because this is pure psychological horror at its finest. And I dare you to find another book that can build that kind of tension around one character in mainly one location and still keep your interest through the whole book. And at the end, still be terrifying. That's a hard thing to do, but this book definitely does it. That's why it's my number 2 favorite Stephen King book. And my number 1 Stephen King book is on everybody's list, and it's probably number 1 on most people's lists, and that would be It. But It is important to me not only because it's my favorite Stephen King book, and not only because it's my favorite horror fiction book, but it is also my favorite book of all time in any genre. Out of all the books I've read in my long, maybe too long, some people might say, life, this is my favorite. This is at least a yearly read for me. Since the day it came out, I've read it at least once a year, sometimes more than once. And I like to say I know the book inside and out, but if you mention any part of that book, any scene in that book, from the first time I read it, I had a mental movie playing when I was reading, and that has never changed. And if you mention something in that book, I can picture it in my head. I can picture that movie from that part of the book playing in my head. I know the kids. I know them as children. I know them as adults. I know Henry. I know the town. I see what they look like. I see that house on Neibolt Street. I can see it in my mind the way it was described in the book. I see the creatures and the fear that all of these people experienced throughout the book. I see it very clearly in my mind. So clear, in fact, and this is where I'm going to talk about the movies that have come from this book, is that I've never really liked any of the movies, even though they're good movies. I'm not saying that. But because of my love for this book, and because of the fact I've read it so much, and because of the fact that you can never put everything I was feeling while reading this book, or the movie that was playing in my mind can never be brought to a cinema near me. You know, it just can't be done. Because, you know, I know everybody, you know, the book's better than the movie. I get that. And that's not really the case here. Because I thought the two movies that just came out recently, I thought the second one was fantastic, really good. Probably my favorite. I didn't really like the first one, though, because I was looking at it on the TV going, you know what? This one's got John Boy Walton and the dude that plays the judge from Night Court as characters in my Stephen King movie. How dare you do that? I took umbrage. There's an old person word you kids can learn. But I've come to appreciate it for what it was. But still, that wasn't it neither, that this movie was just horrible. It was just that it could never, ever come close to the amount of fear, the amount of terror, the amount of tension, the amount of hope and hopelessness that this novel gives me when I read it and I'm entranced and in that world and the movie's playing in my head. It just can't compare. And that's nothing against the screenwriters, filmmakers. They just can't do it because they can't see inside my head, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense. So it's always been my favorite book, at least a once-a-year read for me. I've had it in hardcover. I've had it in paperback multiple times, digital editions. All my devices have this book. What can I say? It's my favorite book of all time. And, of course, that makes it my favorite Stephen King book of all time. So that's my list. Again, leave me a comment and tell me yours. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. That's all right. We're all different, and I'm down with different. It's all good. As always, I want to thank you for spending a little bit of your time listening to me. I really, really appreciate it. Show me some love. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't, and all that good stuff. And down below, you'll see a link to my Twitter feed if you want to join me on there. Stay safe, guys, and until we meet again, keep reading spooky, my friends.